If someone had told me 10 years ago, when I first started as the town librarian, that the most significant event of my life would begin with a shattered window and a stolen collection of antique maps, I would have cataloged the prediction under fiction. My life was a meticulously organized system of quiet routines. The gentle hush of the reading room, the scent of old paper and binding glue, the precise click of my keyboard as I processed new acquisitions. This was my world. Contained, predictable, and safe. Then there was Officer Marcus Thorne. He was not part of my system. He was a disruption, a variable I couldn't account for. A 6'2" monolith of crisp Navy uniform and quiet authority who patrolled our small town with a kind of weary vigilance. For years, he was just a presence, a shape seen through the library's tall arched windows. His cruiser parked across the street, the sun glinting off the windshield. Him, leaning against the door, talking into his radio, his jaw set in a permanent state of seriousness. I observed him the way I observed the migratory patterns of birds in the ornithology section, from a distance, with a detached, academic interest that was a complete and utter lie. The truth was a frantic bird trapped in my ribcage every time his patrol car slowed as it passed my building. My interest was anything but academic. It was a low, constant hum of longing, a foolish and silent ache for a man who likely didn't even know my name. He was the town's protector, a figure of public strength. I was the quiet man who stamped books and preferred the company of long-dead authors. We existed in different worlds, separated by the thick, soundproof glass of my own making. The distance felt as vast and uncrossable as the ocean. He was a fact of the town, like the old clock tower or the river that cut through the valley, solid, imposing, utterly out of reach, and I had resigned myself to that. Until the night the silence of my world was shattered. I got the call at 2 in the morning, the shrill ring of the phone ripping me from a dream. It was the alarm company, a break-in. My stomach became a knot of cold dread. The library wasn't just my job, it was my sanctuary. The thought of it being violated, broken into, felt personal. I threw on clothes, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my keys and drove through the sleeping town. Red and blue lights pulsed against the familiar brick facade of the building, painting the street in frantic, lurid colors. It looked like a wound, and there he was, Marcus Thorne. He stood near the entrance, the flashing lights carving sharp angles onto his face. He looked different outside the context of daylight and routine patrols, more serious, more real. He saw my beat-up sedan pull up and his expression tightened. I got out, the cold night air a shock to my system. "Leo Sterling?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that I felt more than heard. He knew my name. A ridiculous jolt went through me, a spark of warmth in the cold panic. Of course he knew my name. He was a cop. This was his job. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight. "Officer Thorne," I managed, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "We need you to let us in to assess the damage and see what's missing." His tone was all business, but his eyes, a deep, dark brown I'd only ever seen from a distance, held something else. A flicker of something that wasn't just professional duty. Or maybe I was just projecting my own library of romantic fantasies onto him. I led him inside, the familiar chime of the door now sounding like a funeral bell. The mess was contained to the local history room. A window was broken, glass crunching under our feet like ice. A single display case was empty. "The Hemlock County maps," I whispered, the loss a physical blow. They were historical treasures, hand-drawn in the 1800s, irreplaceable. "They knew what they were looking for," Marcus said, his gaze sweeping the room, sharp and assessing. This was the inciting incident. The disruption of routine I never would have wished for, but which had arrived all the same. For the next 3 hours, the library was no longer my quiet haven. It was a crime scene. And I was forced into a proximity with Marcus Thorne that my carefully constructed life had never allowed. He moved through the space with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed at odds with his large frame. He was all quiet competence, his presence filling the rooms in a way the silence never had. I found myself watching his hands. They were large, capable, with clean, short-trimmed nails. calluses on his palms and knuckles that spoke of a life beyond writing tickets and filing reports. He asked me questions, his voice calm and steady, and I answered, trying to keep the tremor out of my own. Trying to pretend my heart wasn't hammering against my ribs like a trapped moth. This was the beginning of the thaw, though I didn't know it then. All I knew was that the glass separating our worlds had been shattered, and he was now standing in mine. Over the next few days, the investigation became my new routine. Marcus was a constant presence. He'd stop by the library in the afternoon, ostensibly for updates, but his visits often stretched longer than necessary. He'd lean against the main circulation desk, the dark wool of his uniform a stark contrast to the warm oak. I started to see the man behind the badge. I saw the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. I saw the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection that made him seem more human, less like a statue carved from granite. I noticed the way he'd rub the back of his neck when he was frustrated, a gesture of weariness that tugged at something deep inside me. He wasn't just the strong, silent type. He was tired. He was carrying the weight of this petty crime and 100 others on his broad shoulders. One afternoon, he was reviewing the list of missing items I'd compiled. He held the paper in one hand, a pen in the other. "This one," he said, pointing to a name on the list. "The cartographer John Hemlock, anything special about him, any known descendants still in the area?" I moved closer, drawn into his orbit by the shared task. The scent of his soap, something clean and sharp like sandalwood and bergamot, reached me. It was subtle, but it filled my senses, short-circuiting my thoughts. I leaned in to look at the paper. "He was a recluse," I explained, my voice a little too breathless. "No direct descendants. His estate was donated to the town archives a century ago." He nodded, making a note. Then he held the pen out to me. "Can you just circle the 3 most valuable maps on this list for the report?" I reached for the pen, and it happened, the first touch. The tips of his fingers brushed against mine. It wasn't a spark, it was a full-blown electrical fire. Heat shot up my arm, a dizzying, terrifying surge that made the air catch in my lungs. It was nothing, an accident, a completely meaningless, unintentional contact that lasted for less than a second. But my body reacted as if I'd been struck by lightning. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned, the pen clattering to the polished floor between us. My heart went into a wild, panicked rhythm. "Sorry," I mumbled, my face flushing with a heat that was pure humiliation. I bent to retrieve the pen at the same time he did. Our heads nearly collided. We both froze, inches apart. Close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark brown eyes. Close enough to see the slight parting of his lips as if he were about to say something. The moment stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken things. The air in the library, usually so still and quiet, was suddenly charged, humming with a new and dangerous energy. He pulled back first slowly. He straightened up, his expression unreadable. He cleared his throat. "I'll get it." He picked up the pen and placed it carefully on the counter, making sure our hands wouldn't touch again. The silence that followed was a physical weight. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. He thinks I'm a freak. He must have felt it, my ridiculous overreaction. But when I finally dared to look at him, he wasn't looking at me with disgust or amusement. He was looking at the scarred wooden surface of the circulation desk, a strange tension in his jaw. "The security system," he said, his voice strained. "The footage from the night of the break-in is corrupted, something about the power surge when they cut the lines." I latched onto the change of subject like a drowning man. "The main server is fried." "But the system does a remote backup. To a cloud server, it's a new feature. I have access from my home computer." This was it, the shift. Suddenly, I wasn't just the victim or the witness. I was the one with the key. The one with the knowledge he needed. He looked at me then, and the professional mask was gone. In its place was a flicker of something raw, frustration, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of desperation. "Sterling Leo," he corrected himself, the use of my first name a small, significant intimacy. Could I come by tonight and see that footage?" The power dynamic had leveled. He was asking for my help. My heart gave a painful, hopeful lurch. Yes, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Of course. That night, my small, quiet apartment felt like a stage set for a play I hadn't rehearsed. I'd tidied obsessively, plumping cushions that didn't need plumping and wiping down counters that were already clean. I was a mess of nerves, a stomach full of agitated bees. A storm had rolled in, the wind rattling my window frames and the rain coming down in hard, driving sheets. It felt fitting. The world outside mirroring the tempest inside me. At precisely 8 o'clock, he knocked. Not a cop's knock, hard and authoritative. It was a softer, more hesitant sound. I opened the door and he was standing there, rain dripping from the tips of his hair and the collar of his civilian jacket. He was out of uniform. The sight of him in a simple gray Henley and worn jeans was somehow more intimidating than the full police getup. The uniform was a barrier, a role. This was just him, just Marcus. "Sorry," he said, gesturing to the rain. "It's coming down hard." "Come in," I said, stepping back. He entered my small living room and the space seemed to shrink around him. He brought the scent of rain and cold night air with him. He was a force of nature in my hermetically sealed world. We didn't speak much at first. I set him up at my small desk, my laptop glowing in the dimly lit room. The only sounds were the clicking of the keyboard, the drumming of the rain against the glass, and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I hovered nearby, pretending to organize a bookshelf, acutely aware of his presence. Aware of the way his shoulder muscles shifted under his shirt as he used the mouse. Aware of the soft sound of his breathing. After an hour of scrolling through grainy, time-stamped footage, he let out a frustrated sigh and leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "Nothing," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Just shadows. The angle is all wrong." He looked defeated. The confident officer was gone, replaced by a tired man at a dead end. "It's okay," I said softly, the words surprising me. "We tried." He turned in the chair to face me, his long legs stretched out, his knee brushing against the leg of my coffee table. Another accidental touch. This time, neither of us pulled away. The contact was a single, small point of heat in the cool room, a connection that held us both in place. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, conversational, "I used to park across from the library sometimes. On my break." My breath caught. "I know," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. A slow, faint smile touched his lips. It transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines. "You knew." It wasn't a question. "I'd see you inside," he continued, his gaze holding mine. "Through the big window, you'd be at the desk or walking through the stacks. You always look calm." Calm, it was the last word I would have used to describe myself, especially when I knew he was watching. "It's a lie," I confessed. "It's all just quiet desperation." The confession hung in the air between us, terribly honest. He didn't laugh, he just nodded, his expression turning serious again. "I get that," he said. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was filled with everything we weren't saying. Years of stolen glances, of unspoken curiosity, of two lonely people living parallel lives in a small town. He broke it. "Leo," he said, and my name on his lips was a revelation. I didn't just come here for the footage. My heart stopped, it just stopped. And then it started again, a painful hammering beat against my ribs. This is it. The moment where everything changes. He slowly, deliberately reached out and placed his hand on my knee, right over the worn denim of my jeans. His touch was warm and firm, not accidental this time. It was intentional. It was a question. My entire body went rigid. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the weight of his hand, the heat of his palm seeping through the fabric, branding me. He watched my face, his own expression a mixture of apprehension and hope. He was taking a risk. He was as scared as I was. That realization broke through my panic. I slowly, shakily lifted my own hand and placed it over his. His fingers instinctively tightened around mine, and then he was leaning in. It happened in agonizing slow motion. The world narrowed to the space between us. The scent of him, rain and soap and something uniquely Marcus. The sound of the storm outside, a distant, muffled roar. His lips met mine. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss from a movie. It was hesitant, questioning. It was unbelievably soft. It was a discovery. The slight roughness of his stubble against my skin, the gentle pressure of his mouth, the quiet sigh that escaped him as my fingers tightened on his hand. It was the most honest thing I had ever experienced. A silent confession that spoke more than words ever could. When he pulled back, it was only by an inch. His forehead rested against mine. His eyes were closed. Leo, he breathed the name a prayer. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I was too full of a terrifying, brilliant, overwhelming joy. The night passed in a dreamlike haze of quiet touches and whispered conversations. We didn't solve the crime. We didn't talk about the future. We just were together. In the small, safe space of my apartment with the storm raging outside, he stayed, the unspoken invitation, the silent acceptance. He slept in my bed, his large frame taking up more than his share, his arms slung protectively over my waist. I lay awake for hours, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, feeling the solid, warm weight of him beside me. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been before. I finally drifted off, my cheek pressed against his shoulder, feeling safer than I ever had in my life. I woke to the pale gray light of dawn, and I was alone. The space beside me in the bed was empty, the sheets cold. For a heart-stopping second, I thought I'd dreamed it all, but the indentation of his head was still on the pillow next to mine. And his scent, that clean, sandalwood scent, lingered in the air, a ghostly presence. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm haze of my memory. I sat up, my heart starting its frantic, familiar rhythm of anxiety. There was a note on my nightstand. A single sheet torn from my own legal pad, his handwriting stark and angular, had to go. Call came in, no name, no talk later. No last night was. Just that had to go. The morning after, anxiety crashed over me like a tidal wave. It was a mistake. He regretted it. He woke up in the clear light of day next to the town librarian and ran. The thought was a physical pain, a shard of ice in my chest. I got up and walked through my apartment, which now felt cavernous and empty. The coffee mug he'd used was still on the counter. His jacket was gone. The world I had woken up to, so full of nascent hope, had evaporated, leaving behind the bitter residue of doubt and self-recrimination. I was a fool, a quiet, lonely man who had mistaken a moment of shared weariness for something more. He was a cop, used to taking control, to getting what he wanted. Maybe I was just a curiosity, an itch he needed to scratch. The thoughts were poison, and I drank them down, letting them spread through my veins. The silence that followed was the worst part. A full day passed, then two, not a word, no text, no call, no cruiser parked outside the library. It was as if he had vanished, not just from my life, but from the town itself. My old solitude, which had once been a comfortable cloak, now felt like a shroud. The quiet of the library was no longer peaceful, it was oppressive. Every chime of the door made my head snap up, a stupid, painful flicker of hope immediately extinguished. The absence of him was a palpable thing, a hole in the fabric of my days. I was back in my carefully ordered world, but everything was out of place. The books were just paper and ink. The silence was just emptiness. I had tasted connection, real and visceral, and now the memory of it tainted everything. I had let him in. I had shattered my own glass walls, only to find myself standing alone in the wreckage. On the third night, I was sitting in the dark of my living room, nursing a glass of wine I wasn't drinking, replaying the kiss, the touch, the sound of his breathing, trying to pinpoint the exact moment I had misread everything. There was a knock on the door, the same soft, hesitant knock from before. My heart seized. It couldn't be, I didn't move. Maybe if I stayed silent, whoever it was would go away, and I could remain here in my self-pity. The knock came again, a little more insistent this time. Leo. His voice muffled through the wood, but unmistakably his. It was a plea. With trembling legs, I got up and walked to the door. I looked through the peephole. It was him. He was in his uniform this time, the familiar navy blue, a stark reminder of the distance between us. He looked exhausted, more tired than I had ever seen him. There were dark circles under his eyes, and the tension in his jaw was back, harder than ever. I opened the door. He just stood there for a moment, looking at me, his expression a storm of emotions I couldn't begin to decipher. Regret, fear, and something else. Something that looked desperately like longing. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse. I stepped aside, my own voice gone. He walked past me into the living room, stopping in the center of the rug, looking out of place, and yet exactly where he was supposed to be. He didn't turn to face me right away. He stood with his back to me, his shoulders slumped. "I'm an idiot," he said, the words blunt and raw. The admission hung in the quiet room. "I'm sorry, Leo, for just leaving." And for the silence. He finally turned around. The confidence, the cop's authority, it was all stripped away. He looked vulnerable. He looked as scared as I felt. "The call was real," he said. "A lead on our map thief. We were up for 48 hours straight, chasing it down. We got him, got the maps back." The news barely registered. All I could focus on was his face, the honesty in his tired eyes. "That's not an excuse," he continued, taking a step closer. "I could have called, I could have texted, I panicked." "You panicked," I echoed, the word sounding strange. He was the one who never panicked. "Not about the job," he clarified, his voice dropping even lower. "About this, about you, about what happened here." He gestured around the room at the space that had held us. "This is new territory for me, Leo. I'm good at my job. I know the rules, I know the procedures, but this," he shook his head, a look of profound confusion on his face. "There's no manual for this." He took another step, closing the distance between us until he was only an arm's length away. "I ran," he admitted, his gaze unwavering. "Not because I wanted to, but because I was scared. Scared of how much I didn't want to run, scared of how right it felt being here with you." The confession unraveled the knot of anxiety in my chest, leaving a tender, aching space in its place. "I thought you regretted it," I whispered, the admission costing me everything. A look of genuine pain crossed his face. "No," he said, his voice fierce. "Never. Regret was the last 2 days, waking up alone, not being here." "That was regret." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between us for a second before he gently cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek, a soothing, grounding touch. "I'm not good at this, Leo." "At feelings." "Me neither," I breathed. A small, weary smile touched his lips. "Then we can be bad at it together." And then he did something that changed everything again. He slowly, deliberately reached up to his chest. His fingers worked at the pin on the back of his badge. The small, metallic sound of it coming free was impossibly loud in the quiet room. He held the polished silver shield in his palm for a moment, looking down at it. This symbol of his authority, of his public self, of the barrier that had always stood between us. Then he stepped past me and placed it on the small table by the door. He took off the heavy belt with his gun and radio, laying it carefully beside the badge. When he turned back to me, he was no longer Officer Thorne. He was just Marcus. He stepped close, his hands finding my waist, pulling me gently against him until there was no space left between us at all. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his breath warm against my skin. I could feel the tension drain out of him, his body relaxing against mine as if he were finally letting go of a great weight. He stayed like that for a long time, just holding me, his arms wrapped tightly around my back. I brought my own arms up, my hands pressing flat against the solid plane of his back, feeling the strength and the weariness in him. Then he lifted his head, his lips close to my ear. He whispered the words, a low, private rumble meant only for me. "This is all I've wanted." It wasn't what I had expected to hear, but it was everything I'd been waiting years to know. It was the truth, it was the key, it was the beginning. In the weeks that followed, a new routine began to form. It was a routine built for two. There was coffee in the morning, 2 mugs on the counter instead of 1. There was the comfortable weight of him in my bed every night, his steady breathing a lullaby that chased away the last vestiges of my anxiety. His world began to bleed into mine. His uniform shirt would be draped over the back of my desk chair. His keys and wallet would be on the table next to my books. These small signs of his presence were anchors, grounding me in this new, unbelievable reality. We learned each other's rhythms. The way he needed silence after a long shift, the way I needed to read for an hour before sleep. We found a quiet harmony, a domestic intimacy that felt more profound than any grand, passionate declaration. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of bacon. I walked into the kitchen to find him standing at my stove, wearing a pair of my gray sweatpants that were far too short on him and one of my old t-shirts that was stretched tight across his shoulders. He turned when he heard me, a spatula in his hand, a slow, easy smile on his face. The morning light streamed in through the window, catching the gold flecks in his eyes. In that moment, he wasn't a cop and I wasn't a librarian. We were just two men making breakfast in a small, sun-drenched kitchen. "Morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my heart so full it felt like it might actually burst. I walked over to him, wrapped my arms around his waist from behind, and rested my cheek against his back. He leaned into the embrace, his work-roughened hand coming up to cover mine where they were clasped over his stomach. We stood like that for a minute, the only sounds the sizzling of the bacon and the quiet thud of my heart against his back. This was real. This was happening. Looking back, I see that my old life wasn't fulfilling. It was just safe. I had built my walls so high, not to keep the world out, but to keep myself in. I was a curator of my own solitude, carefully preserving my loneliness because I was terrified of the alternative. Marcus wasn't just a plot twist. He was a cataclysm. He was the storm that broke down the door and shattered the windows. He was the disruption that dismantled my quiet, ordered world and forced me to build a new one, a better one. A truer one. Lying in bed that night, his arm a heavy, comforting weight across my chest, I watched the faint patterns of headlights from the street crawl across the ceiling. For years, I had watched the world from behind glass. Now the world was here beside me, breathing softly in the dark. He had taken off his badge, he had laid down his armor, and in doing so, he had given me the courage to do the same. He had shown me that the greatest risk isn't letting someone in. It's spending a lifetime locked away from the one person who was always waiting, right on the other side of the door.